Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Jeff, you've been really smart about the way that you've built your rental portfolio and also the way that you're protecting what you built.
Well, a person spends a lot of time, money, effort, sweat on building their portfolio. And if you're going to lose that all in one day, that's terrible. So, and you want to be able to pass this on down to your children, to your grandchildren, and so on. And so you don't want to lose it because you weren't careful enough about protecting your assets.
Jeff brings up a really good point. We put so much time, effort, and money into building a rental portfolio. And if we're not smart about the way that we protect ourselves, if something goes wrong, you could end up losing everything you've worked so hard to build. On the podcast today, Jeff is going to share with us what he does to protect his rental portfolio. Joining us on the show today from Youngstown, Ohio is Jeff Rickerman. We'll take a really quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Jeff. It's a lot of work to find a really good rental property. And when you actually find that property, you want to make sure you're working with a lender that can get that loan closed. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender, and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of loan programs, and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started today, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056.
Rental Income Podcast.
Before we get into today's interview, I just want to point out that Jeff is not an attorney. He's not a CPA. He's not an insurance agent. He's just an investor sharing his knowledge and his understanding of how things work. Things could be totally different in your state, so make sure you talk to your own professional before you take action with anything that you hear on today's podcast. I mean, we could be totally wrong about some of the stuff that we discuss, so definitely check things out for yourself. With that being said, Jeff, before we get into how to protect yourself legally, I want to see if there's anything that you try to do with the way that you approach people and you approach different situations. Because I feel like a lot of problems that become legal problems can be resolved if you just talk to people with respect. Do you think I'm right in that?
So it's very important in my eyes, and I've kind of lived my whole life this way, but you need to be humble and kind. You need to treat people with respect. And if you treat people well, they're going to treat you well. If you're a crappy person, you treat people badly, they're going to be motivated to do you harm. Whereas if you treat people really well and with lots of respect and you bend over backwards to help them out, then they're going to do in kind to you.
Yeah. Let's talk about protecting yourself legally. And probably the number one question that I get is, should I put my properties in an LLC? In your experience, is it a good idea to own your properties in an LLC?
Absolutely. No, really, that's the only way to go about it. To own them in some type of entity, not to own them in your personal name. Absolutely. That's very important.
What about having, I guess like some people want to have an LLC for each property. Other people maybe have one LLC for their portfolio or maybe one LLC for a couple of properties. What do you think is the best way to do it?
There really is no best way. It depends on your personal situation, how many properties you own, how much equity you own in those properties. It's something you have to be really careful about, because the whole purpose of the LLC is to provide you with protection. Protection from losing your personal house, from losing other things that you own. And basically what happens in a properly formed and set up LLC, the worst case scenario is that you lose everything that LLC owns. So that's why an LLC is so important. They cannot go after your personal assets as long as the judge decides not to pierce the veil of your LLC. And I mentioned that because it's a very important factor in this. So when you're thinking about how to do your LLCs, it really depends on what the equity you have in each house. So you have to decide what your level of tolerance is, and this depends on how many properties you own, how much you have in equity in those properties. Basically, if you injure someone through fault of your own, through something that maybe a contractor of yours did, but someone gets injured and it's really on you, it's your liability, then the judge is going to want to give them an award. And if you have $0, or if you have, let's say, $25,000 for the judge to give that person for a really serious injury, then that's when the judge is going to pierce your corporate veil and go after everything. So you've got to have a reasonable amount of equity in that LLC so that your corporate veil does not get pierced. Maybe it's 100,000, maybe it's 150,000, maybe it's 200,000. It also depends again on how much you have. Like maybe it's 1/10 of what you have. So if you have, let's say you have 10 houses that you have $100,000 of equity in. Well, there's $1 million all put together. Well, now, so each one of those has $100,000 in equity. Maybe you want to have an LLC for each two of those houses. Again, it's something you really need to look at and think about. But you do need to, you want to protect your assets, but you also don't want the judge going after everything you own. There's a thing called equity stripping where a lot of people do that. They'll strip all the equity out of their LLC to shift it over to another property or to put it into their own bank account. But if there's no equity in your LLC, then you're going to run into a big problem there.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So equity stripping is really something to not do. I mean, you really want to have some equity in the portfolio. Like you've got to put yourself at some risk. You just don't want to risk everything.
So yeah, you're absolutely right on.
Now, let's talk about piercing the corporate veil, because this is a real concern. You've got to really make sure that you operate your LLC properly. One thing that comes to mind is if you have a repair on the property, if you don't pay for that out of your LLC, if you just put that on your personal credit card, that could also get you in trouble if there was a claim, right?
You pay business expense the worst one you can do. So that's not the worst one that you could do. The worst thing you could do is you could pay a personal expense with a business card. So each entity is its own person, and it has to be totally individual. Each LLC, and that's the other thing too. You're talking about the number of LLCs you have. If a person has 30 properties and they say, okay, well, I'm going to put each property in an LLC. Are you really going to maintain those LLCs as you should? I don't really think so. I don't think you're going to be maintaining, because there's a whole process for maintaining each LLC. Each LLC needs to have its own bank account. Each LLC should have its own credit card. And as you say, you can't commingle them. You can't take money out of one LLC's bank account and just throw it right into another LLC's bank account. There's a way you need to do that. You need to, if you're taking money out of one, you can't loan money from, you can do this stuff, but it's unadvisable. You don't want to loan money from one LLC to another LLC. You want to keep those as totally separate entities. If you are taking money out of one LLC to put in another LLC, it needs to be a distribution out of the one LLC to the owner, and then the owner makes a contribution to the bank account of the other LLC. It's not just transferred from one bank account to the other.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the other thing to consider too is just the cost of keeping your LLC up and running. If you have multiple LLCs, your state may have filing fees you have to pay. You've got the accounting hassle of keeping everything separate. So I think there's a limit on to how many LLCs you're going to reasonably be able to keep up. So I think that's a good point. Now, the other thing that comes to mind is insurance. So I imagine that you have insurance on your properties. Would you say that having the right insurance is maybe even more important than having your LLC set up right?
Yeah, absolutely. Insurance is one of the, before you even close on property, you need to have the insurance set up and having the correct insurance set up. And you need to not just insure your properties, but you need to insure everything. And so before you even start thinking about the insurance, you need to know what your assets are and have your assets all written down and understand. Because a lot of people have more assets than they realize. And so in order to protect your assets, you need to know what they are, and then you need to insure those assets. So, yeah, you should have a separate insurance policy for every house. Depends on your state, your location, no less than $500,000 of liability insurance on each house. As far as your loss insurance for the house, whether you're looking for a cash payout or what you're looking for as far as that goes, that's up to you. You decide how much you have in that house, and if you had a total loss on that house, what you want the insurance company to pay you, because the more you want to be paid out, the more that policy is going to cost you. But on the general liability, which is what we're talking about here, at least $500,000. And then you should have a PUP, or a personal umbrella policy. And that PUP covers everything you own. It covers all your houses, covers your personal house, covers your cars, covers maybe you own some land, whatever it is you own. That PUP covers all those things. And that PUP, again, depends on what state you live in. I mean, you have to look at, in order to figure these things out, and this is a lot like work. It takes some time to figure it out. It takes talking to people that have been there and done it already. But, for example, in Ohio, the worst case scenario happens. Maybe a resident decides to get a swimming pool, even though it's prohibited on the lease for them to get one. The next door neighbor kid comes and drowns in the swimming pool. In Ohio, that's probably a $2 to $3 million payout. In states like Florida or California, that's probably a $10 million payout. So that's what your limits on your PUP are going to be on what the payouts would be in your state. You have to really look at your state and then decide from there how much insurance you need.
And what amazes me is that it's surprisingly cheap to set up a PUP or an umbrella policy. We're talking like a few $100s a year.
You and I both know the reality is anybody can sue you for anything at any time.
Yep.
Now, whether they'll win that lawsuit is another story or not, but how much time, money, and effort is going to be on your part to defend that, even if you're completely innocent.
Right. Right. Now, that's a good point about anyone being able to sue you. And I think a lot of my focus is on tenants, like protecting myself from a tenant suing you. But I think there's some risk from a contractor. If you have a contractor doing some work on your property, how do you protect yourself from something happening to the contractor and then the contractor suing you?
So you need to make sure you need to have a very good independent contractor agreement. First, you need to make sure that you need to have a certificate of general liability insurance from that contractor. You need to know and again, this depends on your state, because some state on the workers' compensation insurance, some states are run by the state, some other states are run privately. But you need to make sure that the workers' compensation insurance is in place with that contractor. You also need to know who that contractor is bringing with them. So a lot of times that contractor wants to bring their brother or their brother-in-law or their cousin or whoever it is to come work with them. Well, it depends on what that relationship. So are they independent contractors for the contractor? Because that's going to depend on what insurance you need to see for them. So if they are employees of the contractor, those folks will not need general liability insurance, and they will not need workers' compensation insurance because they're covered under the contractor's workers' compensation insurance. If they're all contractors, each one of them is a separate contractor, they just happen to work together, you're going to need to see general liability insurance plus workers' compensation, proof of workers' compensation insurance for each one of those individuals coming on your job site. So there's a lot of work. You can't just say, okay, well, come on over and do this. There's a lot of work you need to do up front to make sure you're protected from the liability of those contractors. Because, a lot of people think that if a contractor has general liability insurance, that's all we need. That covers them. That covers them if they get injured on the job, and that's totally untrue. The general liability insurance covers them for any damage they do to your property, any harm they do to others, or any harm they do to other people's property. It does not cover an injury that they sustain to themselves or one of their workers.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to just hire a contractor and not check into their insurance, but it's a little bit more work, a little bit more hassle, but I think it's totally worth it to protect yourself. Something else that I think about sometimes, or maybe even worry about, is that I'm going to pay a contractor to do a job, but maybe that contractor has subs that are maybe doing the plumbing or the electric or something else. And maybe I'm paying the contractor, but the contractor isn't paying their subs. Is there anything you can do to protect yourself from a sub coming back to you and saying, hey, I didn't get paid, I'm going to put a lien on your property?
So that's another piece of that contractor paperwork is your mechanic's lien sign off. Now our contractors are paid every Friday, and before they get paid, they sign off on our release of mechanic's lien. And that release of mechanic's lien is a specific legal document. It states the dates that they worked, it states the property address they worked at, and it has a general description of the work they did. And every Friday they sign off on that.
Okay.
Because there's certain things so for them to place a mechanic's lien on their property, they need to post a 30-day notice, allow you 30 days to cure the problem. But you'll find a lot of like shouty contractors, they'll just skip that whole process and they'll go immediately to placing a mechanic's lien. And then again, you've got something to deal with that you don't want. And you're spending a lot of time, money, and effort on dealing with something you should have never had to deal with.
Sure. Now, I'm interested to get your opinion on this. And this has come up on the podcast before, and it's somewhat controversial. And different people have different opinions on this, and that's fine. But I'm interested to see how you handle this situation. When you're talking to a tenant or a contractor, do you tell them that you're the owner of the property, or do you act like you're a property manager?
I do not. When I talk to contractors, I tell them that we work for a bunch of owners around town, and they may get different checks from different LLCs, and that's because we work for a bunch of different owners around town. And I'm not lying to them. I'm being honest to them. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm not telling them the full truth, but I am being honest to them.
Right. And what about with tenants? Like, do you tell them that you're the manager of the property or the owner?
So the manager of the property, you always have a partner. Your partner, anytime there's a question you don't want to answer right away or something you really want to spend some time thinking about, because nothing like thinking about something overnight. It's always, I have to get up with my partner and I'll get back to you.
If the worst case were to happen and you do get served with a lawsuit, what should your next step be? Should you try to deal with this on your own? Should you hire an attorney, or just turn it over to your insurance company and let them deal with it?
Well, you definitely the first thing you want to do is turn it over to your insurance company, because there are penalties for not telling your insurance company if something happens. Someone gets injured on your property, whatever the case is, you got to tell your insurance company right off. And then you got to work with the insurance companies. The problem, and there's a thing out there, a lot of people don't know about this. There's a thing out there that's called an insurance score. And there's different scores for different categories. But if you're seeking property insurance, the insurance score starts at 1. 1 is the absolute best insurance score you can have. 30 is the absolute worst insurance score you can have. And depending on what your insurance score is, it depends on what you pay. That's one of the things that determines what your premiums are. So, and what I was going to say is the problem with insurance companies is they always want to settle. Mm-hmm. Like they always want to. They don't want to fight something. You can say, "Hey, here's what happened." They don't really care. They just want to try to. Can we give this guy $250,000 and make him go away? Right. So you got to be pretty aggressive with your insurance company to make sure that they're acting on your behalf and protecting your insurance score.
Jeff runs a real estate investment club in Ohio. It's called Mahoning Valley RIA. If you want to check it out, maybe attend one of his meetings, I've got a link to his website on my website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 453. I'd like to thank Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're brand new or you want to add to your portfolio, reach out to Shaylee. She's got a ton of different loan programs, and she can find something that'll work for you in your situation. If you want to find out more, or if you want to talk to Shaylee personally, you can track her down at ridgelendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. Make sure you follow the show. I put out a new episode every single Tuesday, and if you're following the show, you'll get notified as soon as the next episode comes out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.